this computer. Yes, we know that. Okay. Okay, I want to welcome everyone tonight to, if you're new to the group, that's fine. If you're an old timer, that's also fine. We're going to, for the people who are new to the group, I usually start with a little introduction about the group. The logo screen that you're seeing for the group's logo screen should be on your computer by now. Switch. We have a very brief agenda. Don't be worried by the fact that there's so many bullet points. Just a bit about the group, its history, and the meetings we have, who's on the board of directors, who pays for things like sponsors, and also the fact that there are sponsorship opportunities. If you have a company that wants this a little time, just 5 or 10 minutes before a meeting, to give a pitch about your company, we'd be happy to set something up with you to take, swag in the form of things we could raffle off. And we've raffled off Pluralsight subscriptions, we've raffled off gift certificates and so forth. So we do have pretty much everything. Anyway, let me not get ahead of myself. We have the YouTube channel, which is where this video will be posted, probably in a day or two. And we have our meeting tonight. This is our meeting, our mission, and it's very simple. We're all about everything related to Azure, infrastructure, development, management, you name it. We can always find a place to put a presentation that fits into that world. We were founded back in 2013 with 4 members, and now we have over 2,000. We're growing all the time. We want more, so tell your coworkers about us, tell your friends about us, okay? We currently are meeting online only like this because of the pandemic, and because thanks to the pandemic, we now have a large bunch of members who are out of the area. So eventually we may move back to in-person meetings, but we'll let you know what happens there. We normally meet every 3rd Thursday. This meeting is actually a makeup meeting. We tried to do this presentation earlier in the month and I screwed up, and we never did get the meeting going. So we rescheduled it for tonight. What I do is a little introduction about the group and followed by the main meeting topic. We're really interested in, if you're interested in doing a presentation, or if you're interested in, a specific topic that you want us to find a presenter for. So let us know, okay? Board of Directors is me. I'm the Azure founder and president. I'm an Azure solution architect with ATOTUS, soon to be an NVIDIAN, and I won't bother to explain that. Roger Dahlman is co-founder and vice president, and he's an enterprise architect at Deloitte. And Tim Warner, who's actually our presenter tonight, is a Microsoft Azure documentation and training specialist. I guess I didn't update this yet, Tim, I apologize. I think I did on the final slide, okay? And Jack Hagler, who's from Vaco, he's our, our director of recruiting, and he's actually paid for the Zoom subscription we're using. Microsoft pays for our meetup dues. Vaco pays for the Zoom description. And the National Technology Council is a sponsor of the group. A Cloud Guru is a training sponsor, although we haven't yet set up any kind of deals for the group where we might have get a break on membership or something like that. We're going to work on that. Sponsorship, again, I mentioned that before. Time at the meeting, if your company wants to take advantage of the sponsorship opportunity, just get in touch with Roger Dahlman. He'll set it up for you. This is our YouTube channel, which is pretty crowded, as you can see. It's whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Okay, upcoming meetings. Again, we have July 10th, but not next month, not June meeting scheduled. So if you're interested in doing a presentation, let us know. And also, if you know someone who's really good at presenting, like Tim is, just let us know that too, okay? Tonight's topic is Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI, and Azure Developer CLI, what to use when. And this time I did get Tim's bio correct. He is a Pluralsight author and tech trainer, past Microsoft senior content developer, and that is his URL if you want to visit it. And with that, I'm going to make Tim, I might as well make Tim the co-host, okay? So that you'll be able to present. Make host, or I'll try co-host first. Yes. Okay. And I will stop sharing. And let's see if you can share. There we go. Good work. Well, that was fast. Good. And I'm going to shut my video off.
All right. Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for being here with us tonight. This session is called Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI, and Azure Developer CLI, What to Use When. As Bill said, I work for Pluralsight as a full-time author. For the past year and change, I worked for Microsoft in their Learn organization. So I got a chance to work a lot with the Azure PowerShell and Azure CLI development teams, as well as quite a few Azure service teams. So I'm bringing to the table quite a bit of insight. Of course, I can't share any NDA or non-disclosure agreement bound info, but anything that's public or that those team members didn't mind my sharing, well, that's why we're here. I've got the meeting chat on my other monitor, so please, as I'm going along, if anything strikes your fancy, if you want to know something that I'm not talking about, or if something I said was unclear, just whatever, please pop it in the chat, would you? And I'll always reserve time at the end of the presentation for dedicated Q&A as well. I figure I could present for any length of time, but I'll probably keep it to 35 minutes or so, nice and tight. So the way we'll start is just briefly some foundational information. That sounds kind of mysterious. I don't know what I was thinking when I chose that bullet point. But you're here, I presume, because you're looking for practical guidance on differentiating Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI, and then the latest member of the family, Azure Developer CLI. And that's exactly what I'm going to give you. Which CLI to use when? Let me let the proverbial cat out of the bag and say that the big answer is it depends. You knew I was going to say that, didn't you? Session materials. If you want a copy of the slide deck, that's totally fine. Hi, Omar. Unfortunately, I'm having an issue with my URL shortening service, and it's that darn Mr. Musk. A lot of the Twitter API integrations broke when he started charging $40,000 a month or whatever it is that he's done. So I had to use a generic service here. At any rate, rebrand.ly/AZCLI. I'll go ahead and put it in the chat too. Session materials, rebrand.ly/AZCLI. And that link will give you a PDF version of this slide deck. I don't have any other code files because I'm actually going to be using, wait for it, GitHub Copilot in my demos. So all the code that we do is going to be generated largely by artificial intelligence. So to that end, I've packed in everything into this slide deck. So there's your session link. Okay, so what's this foundational information all about anyway? Yes, the ARM REST API and abstraction. So in Azure Resource Manager, the service is the Azure Management Service. I guess that's why it's called Resource Manager. It's a REST API, so it communicates over the hypertext transfer protocol, and anything you're doing in Azure is going to be an HTTP request into ARM, and ARM then hands off to what's called a resource provider. If you're interacting with databases or web apps or virtual machines, whatever the case may be, it's essentially a one-to-many parent-childish relationship between ARM and those services. Of course, everything is authenticated with Azure Active Directory, but what we're concerned with are these layers of abstraction. Now, you might already know you could use curl or postman to make requests to ARM directly. So anything else we do, whether we're in the Azure web portal, whether we're using any of these CLIs like Azure PowerShell or the Azure CLI, if we're a programmer and we're using a package or library or software development kit, really all of those are just, in a sense, front ends or abstractions that under the hood boil down to an HTTP request into Azure Resource Manager. So I think I mentioned that to you just to set the stage, just make a global statement that really it boils down to your preference, doesn't it? How you're addressing ARM. However, there are some things to keep in mind, which is what I hope is going to be some of the real value I bring to you today. So what is a command line interface or a CLI? Text-based UI. You can interact with software and OSs, yes, using a prescribed syntax. So far, so good. So what does this make you think of? I think of administrative automation, automation for a developer too, for that matter, infrastructure as code, DevOps, CI, CD. I mean, fill in the blank with whatever tech buzzword or acronym you want about doing work faster and more efficiently, isn't it? Whether you're just interactively looking up stuff in Azure with a CLI tool, or you're actually building automation scripts that you're running on a schedule, or maybe as a Azure function, you've got a predefined event trigger or something that trips that code to run, whatever the case may be. Besides the Microsoft CLIs that we're looking at today, just want to quickly survey some other CLIs that hopefully are in your tool set nowadays. There's the Git client. If you're storing your infrastructure as code, your application code in a Git repository, GitHub has a perfectly serviceable CLI that's cross-platform and enables you to do just about anything. Push code into a new repository, create pull requests, issues, anything you do pretty much in the GitHub web portal, you can do using the GitHub CLI. For infrastructure as code, nowadays, the recommendation is to use Bicep. Bicep has a separate CLI with a collection of Bicep commands where you can send deployments into Azure and, take JSON, convert it to Bicep, convert Bicep to JSON, whatever. If you're working with containers at all, there's the Docker command line interface. Again, infrastructure as code, cross-cloud, Terraform is a good choice. And then as a developer, you may use the .NET CLI for package management particularly. So there's lots of these command line interfaces available, as you can see. Now, what about Microsoft certification? How much do you have to know about, say, PowerShell or the Azure CLI in order to be successful on a Microsoft test? As a matter of fact, is it going to be mostly PowerShell, mostly CLI, both? How do you know? Let's just address that briefly. There are 4 different types of Microsoft certification exams you might know about. There's the beginner one is called Fundamentals, like AZ 900. Those aren't even technically, they're not supposed to be technical exams as such. They're meant for beginners, so you'll never see code on those. But the other levels, the associate, expert, and specialty, you can pretty much bank on seeing code because that's the emphasis nowadays. I mean, who wants to click around in web portals unless it's the first time you're doing something? Or, what's that old saw? If you do the same thing more than 3 times, think about automating it. How are you going to automate a graphical interface? I normally give my students in cert prep classes the guidance that you should shoot for intermediate level PowerShell and Azure CLI. Just as a general rule. What do I mean by intermediate level? Well, beginner level would be just recognizing commands. That's not what Microsoft does nowadays. Nowadays, you're going to see code in context. So you'll see variable declarations, you'll see conditional logic and looping. It goes more into real world usage and less just reciting a particular command name. The way that the exam items normally work, it's called an active screen item. I'll just quickly use my drawing tools, where you'll see an Azure CLI script or an Azure PowerShell script on the screen. And then embedded within the code, there'll be drop-down list controls. There may be 3 or 4 of them at different points in the code. And your job to tackle that question is to literally open each control, and each one will have maybe 4 choices in it. And you're basically filling in the code. And so what are you doing? You're demonstrating to Microsoft that you understand how to use this language in context to whatever problem and solution is being discussed in the question. The other way that this will show up is in a statement analysis type item, where it starts out the same, where you've got some code, Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell code, and then some scenario. And then there'll be a table that has maybe 3 to 5 statements. This code is going to do blah. This code should do blah, that kind of stuff. And then there's radio buttons where you either mark yes or no, you agree with that statement or you're not. So the point is that these exams go much deeper than just fact recall. And that's something that the Microsoft Worldwide Learning Team has as a prime directive of theirs. In fact, they're not allowed to write questions that are lower level. They have to involve a good amount of analysis. All right. So now let's get into each of these command line interfaces. Now, PowerShell is technically a shell environment, but it functions as a command line interface. So what are we talking about here? Well, just some high level facts, just so we can, level set. What's wonderful about PowerShell and Azure PowerShell? Well, first let's talk about PowerShell 7 and specifically. It's cross-platform and open source, that the Microsoft engineers have developed PowerShell to conform to the .NET standard library, which means that it works on a Windows machine with either PowerShell 5.1, which is sometimes called Windows PowerShell, but also it'll work with PowerShell 7. Now, that said, I strongly recommend that you install the Azure PowerShell modules only under PowerShell 7. They'll work under 5, but in many ways, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, because Azure PowerShell, as it stands now, is made for PowerShell 7. And there's some reasons for that that I'll go into shortly. So if you're using that combination of PowerShell 7 with the Azure PowerShell modules, your code should work exactly the same, regardless of whether the system is Windows, Mac OS, or Linux. That's the great value proposition. Now, Azure PowerShell is not just one module. Each resource provider generally has their own module, which means when you install Azure PowerShell, you're actually installing, I don't know how many separate modules. Used to be back in the day, back when we walked to work uphill through the blinding snow and then back home from work, also uphill in the blinding rain. Back in those days, all of the commands were in a single monolithic module, which has big problems from a performance standpoint, from an updating standpoint, certainly. Now what happens is you install AZ, and that's actually a bootstrapper that orchestrates the installation of all the separate resource provider specific modules. Don't make the mistake of installing Azure RM or Azure. Those are the old versions. They're not being maintained. They're not meant for cross-platform. They don't work. We'll just leave them alone. We're looking at AZ is what we need to install. Okay, so what are we doing with Azure PowerShell? Well, just like PowerShell is a general purpose automation and scripting language, Azure PowerShell gives us general Azure management and infrastructure as code capabilities, with the added benefit that all of the skills that you've developed using PowerShell in other contexts, you can roll into Azure PowerShell 100%, which is really important, it seems to me. We also can extend PowerShell just by installing additional modules. Now, I don't think I've got, oh, I do. I wasn't sure I had this point on the slide. Common beginner confusion is, where is the stuff to do Azure AD users and groups here? I'm looking through my Azure PowerShell commands here and I'm not seeing any. It's important to know that the AZ module family is for Azure Resource Manager, the ARM API. Azure AD is actually a separate REST API called Microsoft Graph. So therefore, that's a separate PowerShell module, Azure AD. So MS Online is yet another. It's for the Microsoft 365 commands like Exchange Online and all that. So just an important point I wanted to sidelight. Here I have we'll do a demo on each of these, but here I've just got some sample code snippets of Azure PowerShell in action. Big guidance from Microsoft here is you don't want a fight to break out between Windows and PowerShell. In other words, on a Windows machine, you're going to have Windows PowerShell 5.1 already there. You'll want to install PowerShell 7, but you want to make sure to install AZ in the current user scope. PowerShell has a lot of scopes, and if you install it into the machine scope, and then you try to get into Azure PowerShell from Windows, you don't want that kind of fight. So the guidance is to install PowerShell 7 and do your install module in the scope of the current user, which is a more granular scope. And that way you can comfortably just use your Azure PowerShell within PowerShell 7 and don't worry about Windows PowerShell unless you have to. Looks like Omar has a question in the queue. Azure RM, yeah, thank you, Alexander, for asking that question. Azure RM is on a deprecation path. You can always go to the MS Learn docs, do a Google or Bing search, and there is a formal statement in there. I trust what Alexander is saying. So February 29th, 2024. But remember, Azure RM was meant for Windows PowerShells, and it's not picking up new capabilities. Azure consists of over 200 resource providers. And it seems to me you want to make sure to leverage that power. So you're going to need the AZ modules, and again, under PowerShell 7. I think you'll find that for the most part, Azure PowerShell is just garden variety PowerShell that follows standard conventions. Now, that said, sometimes you'll see some wonkiness. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is humanity. One thing I learned working for Microsoft is that software engineering teams are human beings above all else. And when you've got 200 odd teams, they're all supposed to be on the same playbook. Let's say we're on Azure Service Bus engineering team. There's a playbook that says that when we develop new capabilities in our service, we need to expose PowerShell and Azure CLI. You know, we need to follow the rules, but functionally, that happens a lot more consistently than I think is reasonable, given, you know, a world's distribution of people. But yeah, there is going to be some, I call it wonkiness, let's say inconsistency from time to time. And that's just the human factor. I strongly believe that. Please understand that if you're so inclined, you can always and should open an issue at the Azure PowerShell GitHub. What else do we have? I think that choosing Azure PowerShell, the reason I would choose it, besides the fact that the syntax is most familiar to me, is the fact that it's not just a text-based CLI. Everything in PowerShell is a .NET object. So you can access events and methods and properties all over the place and do amazing things with your Azure PowerShell. Couple that with the pipeline that enables you to pass these .NET objects from one segment in the pipeline to another. That's a big difference between Azure PowerShell and Azure CLI for sure. That said, sometimes, and again, this is going to be specific to maybe a particular Azure service and a particular engineering team. Sometimes you may be forced to work around the limitations and interact, say, with .NET objects directly. Again, that's part of life really with PowerShell. And I think, again, more than anything else, it turns into a human factor. I worked with one engineering team whose members were proficient with Bash shell scripting and mostly worked on Macs, honestly. And we're pretty much in the dark about PowerShell. It's like, yeah, we know that we need to support PowerShell. It's part of our guidelines, but I don't know what I'm doing, you know, and that's a reality, you know. All right, so what are we going to do as a demo? I'm going to use, as I said, GitHub Copilot because I will take any and every opportunity to show off these AI technologies. So I'm in Visual Studio Code. I have PowerShell 7 already installed. As far as appropriate extensions here in VS Code, I certainly have the PowerShell extension installed. What else do I have? I have GitHub Copilot. I don't have the nightly. I have the release version of it. And if you don't know what GitHub Copilot is, it's a paid service. There is a 60-day trial, and I'm pretty sure they'll let you extend it for another 60 days. Very generous. It's called an artificial intelligence-based pair programmer, and you'll see it in action as we go on today. For me, it's worth every penny. What else do I have installed here? The Azure CLI tools is going to give you support for the Azure CLI in Visual Studio Code, and there is also an Azure Developer CLI extension from that particular team at Microsoft. That's important to have those extensions loaded in so that when we have our files, the file types will be mapped via those extensions, and we can get a debugging environment for PowerShell. We can get icons, you know, the important stuff. We get IntelliSense and all of that. So let me bring up a PowerShell file. And speaking of which, we can see the language mode is correctly auto-detecting PowerShell. I can adjust my PowerShell session menu to make sure that I'm using PowerShell 7, which I am in my terminal. Got my nice handy dandy icon, and it looks like we're ready to rock. So again, you're probably familiar with PowerShell and Azure PowerShell. So I'm really just going to do kind of a Mickey Mouse thing, but I want to do a little bit of gee whiz with GitHub Copilot. So one way that Copilot can give you recommendations is just in comments. You can just use natural language. I'm going to say PowerShell function to give system uptime. And then a common prompt engineering, to use the tech buzzwords. Tech buzzword trick is to be as specific as possible. Give the output as follows. You can see in the gray, you might see what's happening right there, as a matter of fact, is GitHub Copilot. It's making predictions as I type. So I'm just going to say days, colon, and then again, Copilot is asking, do I want to complete it? I'm pressing tab. So we can see there's Copilot in action. It's live generating code. I can hit escape to dismiss it or just continue to type. I can press tab to continue. And then there's also a keyboard shortcut. Sometimes Copilot will have multiple suggestions for you. It's always, I think it's Alt square bracket and then Alt close square bracket to go to the next suggestion. Alt open square bracket to go to the previous suggestion. Whoops. So let me open this function declaration. And we can see here, I want to invoke the little toolbar. There's normally a little GitHub Copilot toolbar that shows up. Wondering why it's not showing up. But that's what we've got. Let me hit tab a couple times here. This is not giving me the output yet, so we can just go to the next line and pause and see what it's doing next. You get the idea. I feel kind of awkward here because this isn't a PowerShell class as such, but Azure PowerShell is, in this example, is bad because it's not even working with Azure. Why don't I do the whole thing over again and focus on Azure? How about function stop Azure VM? Should choose a option that has to do with that. Now, check this out. Sometimes this goes with that suggestion that you got to be careful with these OpenAI models because, you know, just trusting without verifying, you're going to have code break from time to time. In this case, it looks like it starts off strong with some parameter declarations. And in this case, it's just going to do a one-liner, but look at that command that it's doing. Stop Azure RM VM. So it's giving us an old command. Yikes. But what's cool about the OpenAI models, is particularly ChatGPT more than GitHub Copilot, is that you can go into ChatGPT and tell it, look, you messed up. That command is old, and it will, in all likelihood, give you the correction. It works really well. I'll say one more thing, that GitHub is launching a new iteration of GitHub Copilot called GitHub Copilot X. Get on the wait list if you're not on it yet. I've been on the wait list for months and haven't heard anything. I'm really excited about it because it'll write pull request summaries for you. It'll help you write git commit messages. And in this context, when you're in your IDE, it'll be a chat interface to where you can tell it, look, my code's broken, or create a unit test for this. You know, you can invoke it in an easier way than from what you're seeing here is what I'm trying to say. Any questions, comments, concerns, curiosities? I don't see anything else in the chat panel yet. How is Azure command line interface different, or Azure CLI? Well, as of now, and for the time being, I don't mean to sound like I know something that I shouldn't tell you, because I don't. It's an open source Python application, just like PowerShell, Azure PowerShell, open source at GitHub. Azure CLI started its life as a node application, Azure CLI 1. Then when Microsoft re-architected, recreated it, it became Azure CLI 2. Now we just call it Azure CLI. So it's a Python 3 application, sometimes called XPlat CLI for cross-platform CLI. Syntactically, you'll find that it behaves a lot like Bash and Bash-like languages. It seems to have similarities with, well, Bicep. A lot of the CLIs tend to take take notes from each other in that regard. Big thing though about Azure CLI is that it's not object oriented like PowerShell and Azure PowerShell. Your output, you can adjust the output a number of different ways, but it's just text like a bash environment, no objects. It is extensible. There is an extensibility platform in Azure CLI. You just load those extensions using an AZ command that you'll see in a moment. What's the day-to-day use case for Azure CLI? It's largely the same as Azure PowerShell, Azure Management and Infrastructure as Code. So let's stop right there. Why would you go one way or the other? Well, not too long ago, a few years ago, I guess that's a long time ago in tech, this Azure CLI was really the only game in town if you ran Linux or Mac OS as your main desktop operating system, because before PowerShell became cross-platform, before .NET Framework became .NET Core and .NET Standard, PowerShell was Windows PowerShell, simple as that. And so if you're on Mac OS and you're looking to do administrative scripting or even just interactive quick lookups from a terminal, you would do Azure CLI. And at Microsoft, I found that in terms of the customer base, it depended on the comfortability of a team, that if a team was predominantly Linux or Mac OS oriented, they tend to more naturally gravitate towards the Azure CLI, just like a team that might have more experience in the Windows environment with WinBatch or CMD type scripting, they tend to go generally towards PowerShell. You know, I think, again, that's humanity, isn't it? Sticking with what's most comfortable for you historically. The output types you can switch up are JSON. C is colorized, so uncolorized or colorized JSON, colorized or uncolorized YAML. Table, which is what I like to switch mine to for easier on-screen viewing, or tab separated value. All right, so here we have some sample commands just so you can get a quick look and feel. To add extensions into the Azure CLI, as you can see, it's AZ extension add. What are some representative examples? Well, right here, you can see that Azure DevOps has an Azure CLI extension with a bunch of commands that are specific to Azure DevOps. Another one I can think of is the Azure Deployment Stacks service that is surfaced in Azure CLI as an extension. There's a number of them. Let me see, what else do we have here on this slide? Yeah, you'll find that unless you're starting to get into more complex operations like queries and looping and that kind of stuff, the basic mechanics of the CLI should be pretty familiar to you if you've worked in Bash particularly. You know, every command is AZ something, and there's some logic to how the commands stack, similarly to how it would work, say, in the HashiCorp configuration language. Like I said, there's a lot of shared ideas here. So you've got AZ, and then your context. Deployment would be, you're going to do some kind of resource group or subscription or management group operation. Group would denote a resource group. Then your verb is going to be the specific action, create, update, delete. And then your parameters normally have a double dash long version or a single dash single letter short version. So the idea is you can get pretty fast, actually, just working interactively at a command prompt. In between tab completion and just using single dash short parameters, you can be pretty blazing fast. All right. Let me see, what else do we have here? Like I said, once you go beyond the basics, though, it can get pretty arcane, the syntax can, in my opinion. Like, I love PowerShell with select object and where object and this. I mean, look at this. This is parsing some VMs and looking for particular locations. You might see this and say, yeah, no problem, I understand it. But it's nowhere near as just immediately recognizable, to me anyway, and I'm just speaking for me now, than it would be in PowerShell. You can do, like in PowerShell, you can do a lot of programmery stuff like variables and conditional logic and loops. Here we're declaring a couple variables and doing a for loop. But again, if you're if you're good with bash scripting, you're already fine, because I mean, bash scripting is one of the most, again, I'm being so opinionated here. It's the reason I say that is because it's tough for me. And I'm sure if I had to do it every day, it would no longer be tough. But at any rate, let's take a quick look, because there's a couple things with Azure CLI in particular that I wanted to draw your attention to. And I wanted to start right here in the terminal. So one thing, and this is a great way to learn Azure CLI quickly. Now, I'm not going over installation. You could just look up install Azure CLI. The MS Learn docs are better than I could ever teach on that. But once you've installed the AZ CLI, of course, you'll want to sign in. So we'll want to do an AZ login. Hello. And then there's going to be a number of parameters that we can choose from. I'm waiting to see if I'll get some completion. It looks like I'm not. But this is going to pop open a browser-based flow, which I will quickly update my credentials to sign in with the correct account on my second monitor. Hang on just a second here. I want to make sure I'm getting into the correct Azure AD tenant. All right, you have logged into Microsoft Azure. Okay, is default true? Is it got me into the correct subscription? I should be an Azure Pass, yes. If that were not the case, I could do AZ account set, and here we see our tab completion coming in to help. How do you know that? Well, just like a lot of Bash Mac terminal type apps, you can ask for help at any stage. You could do AZ -- help, or you could do something AZ account -- help and say, show me what the subgroups are and commands within account. So here we can see AZ account list, AZ account clear, AZ account set, and it goes from there. So the help is pretty cool. And one fun fact, you don't have to do an update help like you do with PowerShell to make sure that you've got this help syntax local. Another thing you'll want to do, at least initially on your workstation, is run AZ configure. What this will allow you to do after you specify that you want to change your settings is what I do right off the bat. Make sure that my default output is set right. It's going to default to JSON. And if that's your bag, that's fine. But generally in a terminal, I want a table. So I'm going to choose 3 for table. Do I want to do logging? That could be useful for troubleshooting. Do we want to do data collection? I'll say no. How long do we want our cache? 10 minutes is TTL. That's fine. So there you have it. So notice again that we're back to just a shell prompt. So there's a difference. Azure CLI is invoked every time by using AZ, whereas I'm in PowerShell right now, so I can just write PowerShell directly all day long if I want to. So another thing, I've mentioned that I have a tip on learning Azure CLI very quickly, and dare I say, kind of fun. It makes use of one of those extensions that I told you about. You don't actually have to install it. It's auto-loaded. It's the interactive extension. So if I do AZ interactive here, if it's the first time you've run this, there may be a little pause while it loads the extension, but it's going to give us a little, well, it's an interactive environment, and it's pretty cool because it's got really fast IntelliSense built into it. And we're going to see as we start to type, it's going to give us live documentation and syntax help and examples and all that. So it can be awfully useful for, especially if you're getting started, but even if you're not getting started. Now, it's not going to help us with administrative scripting up here, but you've got to start somewhere. So let's say that we were going to just enumerate, what do I have in my Azure subscription? I'm not even sure. I could do AZ, and notice it immediately starts to drop down my context here. I wanted to enumerate resource groups. So let's see. I think that's under deployment. Whoops, not deployment scripts. Yeah, so you can just buzz around like this. So it looks like it needs more information here. Or I could do something like AZVM list. And as I type and just pause, I was typing a bit fast a moment ago. If there's any required or optional parameters, notice that they show up, and it mentions down here, and it gives you some examples and so on. So again, this is just that interactive shell environment that you can invoke from your command prompt or a PowerShell prompt. it can be a comfortable interactive environment. And then to exit, we can do quit. And now we're back in business to our PowerShell prompt. The Azure CLI tools extension will recognize the AZ CLI extension by default. Notice down in the lower right, it says Azure CLI scrapbook. But I just want to show here that as long as you have the extension installed, it's going to give you IntelliSense completions. And if you have GitHub Copilot layered even on top, one thing you might find is that GitHub Copilot sometimes gets in a fight with VS Code IntelliSense. So you may want to think about temporarily disabling IntelliSense for a particular language extension if you want just to unleash GitHub Copilot. Could you disable Copilot selectively? I'm not sure. You can always come down to the lower right here where the Copilot icon is and click it. That'll globally turn off Copilot. That would be one way of solving that problem. Looks like my keyboard is kind of locked up here. Hope my screen share is okay. It's annoying. There we go. Whoops. Yeah, so AZVM. Sometimes you might have noticed that the IntelliSense can be syrupy slow with some languages. You can do Control Spacebar to give VS Code a kick in the seat to try to generate some IntelliSense. I think I've noticed this historically with the Azure CLI. Pretty annoying. So let's go back to the slides. I want to be mindful of time. And let's take a look at a CLI that you may not be familiar with because it's the newest member of the family. The Azure Developer CLI, which if you look it up at Microsoft Learn Docs, it's a public preview feature. So just the standard disclaimers apply. Thank you, James, for the confirmation about the screen share. Right, and Alexander is calling out an important point that in VS Code, you've got the ability to save your setup, that is your editors, your layout, your folders as a workspace. And then you've got your layers of settings. You've got the application-wide settings, the workspace settings, and he's mentioning that we could selectively disable GitHub Copilot in a workspace. That's a good tip. Thanks for that. Okay, so let's come back to PowerShell. Yeah, so what I was saying with public preview is because the Azure Developer CLI is not generally available or GA, unless you hear directly from this team at Microsoft that they will support you in production, you should assume that there's no service level agreement, nor any customer support. And the guidance for Microsoft is to use public preview features only in non-production environments and in evaluation capacity. You might ask, well, why do they even give it to us? Well, you know the answer to that. It's really twofold. One, it's in Microsoft's best interest because hopefully you're going to give them valuable feedback. But number two, it puts these tools in your hands earlier than you would get them otherwise. I think it's pretty stable for what it is. If I think just a top line opinion, the template library is pretty, it's not too much more than a proof of concept at this point, but I'll have more to say on that shortly. What is Azure Developer CLI? Well, it was written in Go, interestingly enough. It's a Google Golang application, open source at GitHub. And what it includes is a library of canned application templates. Now that application templates list is semi-extendable. That is, the ones that you can get from the Azure Developer CLI directly come from Microsoft, so we have to wait on them to expand that list. But I'll show you a pretty active GitHub repo where there's a lot of community support where people are putting in their own templates that you can directly, you can just manually clone those down to your own workstation and work from them there. But the value proposition here is that Azure Developer CLI supports rapid application development because with a single keystroke, you can bring down a full scaffold of your application that includes not just the typical SRC source code folder, but also infrastructure and pipeline resources as well. Not only that, but wait, there's more. You know how Microsoft has a collection of prescriptive guidance, the Azure Well-Architected Framework, or WAF, the Azure Cloud Adoption Framework, or CAF, and then the Azure Architecture Center, or AAC. That one doesn't have a, an acronym that we can ACK, I guess you could call it. There's a lot of guidance in there. And what I think is pretty cool is that these app templates, these scaffolds, are validated against all those proven practices. So it's a great starting point for a business that's doing cloud development and wants the security of knowing that they're starting from a great foundation. All right, that's the idea here. There are templates from Microsoft and from the community and the major languages supported by Azure, C#, of course, Java, Node, Python. But there's also, like I said, infrastructure templates that go with the source code. So think of Azure App Service web apps, think of Azure Functions, think of Cosmos DB and Azure SQL database. Again, all with pre-built proven practice guidance from the well-architected framework and the Azure Architecture Center. Pipelines too. Hopefully you're doing your application deployment, your infrastructure deployment, and your maintenance and updates in an automation context, maybe at GitHub Actions or in Azure Pipelines. Well, guess what? There's pipeline support for both of those environments baked in as well. You getting the idea? The name of that GitHub repo that's active that I mentioned, we'll look at it, is called Awesome AZD Templates. Really appropriate name, I suppose. You can also make your own. I was studying this the other night. Again, I don't see any way to make it so you can list your own custom templates alongside the Microsoft ones. It's basically a manual operation. Basically, the tutorial that I read the other night was you're setting up your own scaffold in a prescribed way with your own code and with your own bicep and all that. Better than nothing, I suppose. Because this is public preview, we can reasonably assume, I think, that the workflow is going to get more refined over time. Now, this is rapid application development for Azure-based apps. I guess that's why it's called Azure Developer CLI after all. So let's look at some examples. One thing about AZD, and as you can see, it uses a similar pattern to Azure CLI. It's just that the Azure Developer CLI is AZD. You do an init, and then you can specify a Microsoft provided template, and that'll just auto clone it from GitHub down to your machine. If it's ready to go, you can just do an AZD up, and that does everything for you. It's the easy button where it's going to create the infrastructure in Azure based on your templates. It's going to set up automation in your pipelines based on your pipeline config. And then it's going to publish your application to that infrastructure. So that's the easy button. You can then separately, you can configure each element, AZD pipeline config. If you're ready to deploy just the infrastructure, that's AZD provision. If you're looking to deploy just the app code, that's AZD deploy. If you're want to look at streaming logs or whatever, there's a monitor context as well. So one point about all of these CLIs is that we can plug in these commands in our CI/CD, our continuous integration, continuous delivery processes, because I know for a fact that actions exist in GitHub that make it trivial to run these CLIs. And the same thing goes in Azure DevOps and Azure Pipelines, regardless of whether you're using the graphical classic editor or if you're using YAML in Azure DevOps. So let's take a look at the Azure Developer CLI. So let's see here. I've got a dev CLI file here, and let me do an AZD. I was hoping that I could get some really nice IntelliSense here, but VS Code is not behaving particularly well. Let me go back to the slide deck. I'm pretty clumsy, full disclosure, with AZD. AZD init. I'll tell you what, why don't we just do this together live? So I'm in the correct folder, AZD /, you know what I'm going to do next, right? And that'll give us a quick run of what we're doing. So we authenticate with Azure with AZD auth. That makes sense. AZD init to initialize a new app. What if we just want to view some templates here? So we've got a template context. So let me do an AZD template, and then we could, again, extend. And the same rule would apply for Azure CLI. List, I figured. It looks like list shows them all. Show allows us to drill into a specific one. So let me do AZD template list. And then I'm going to combine that with some PowerShell. And then I'm going to pop that into a VS Code editor. Hello, my screen just kind of went all snowy on me. There we go. Okay, so like I said, this is early days still with the Azure developers. So as you can see, they're just all that to-do app that you see in the MS Learn docs. So it's basically a proof of concept where it's done the to-do app in the different languages, the C#, Java, Node, and Python. And it looks like we've got one example that uses relational, and the other ones, most of them are using Azure Cosmos DB for a JSON store. It looks like they're Mongo, interestingly enough. Interesting. So let me grab one of these. I'll just grab this guy right here, the C# SQL one. And let's go back to our other instance and go AZD. I already forgot the dadgum command, init, that's what it is. AZD init. And then let me remind myself of what comes next. The template to use, does it give me an example? Yeah, so we do AZD init -- template. So now it's going to bring down, and you can see it populating live over here on the left. So we've got an SRC source code folder. We've got a unit test folder. We've got a dev container, so you can deploy these and work with this in a VS Code Online dev container, for example. There's an AZDO or an ASDO pipeline. So this would be a YAML pipeline for use with Azure pipelines. We've got a .github with a YAML workflow file here. We've got a .vs code that gives us a debug launch configuration that's specific to this project. We've got an infra folder with a main.bicep that's going to generate the Azure architecture. You see the value prop off the top? So we can go through and hand edit these and tweak these files to our heart's content. And then when we're ready to deploy, we can just do so. Now, the Azure Developer CLI uses this concept of the environment, and that it's basically a namespace that seems to be something to prevent name collisions when you deploy. That it turns into essentially a prefix. So I'm going to call my environment TWAZ1, and hopefully, fingers crossed, that'll generate globally unique names and that kind of stuff. You can always override in your bicep file if you want to make sure that you're going to a particular region and resource group and all that kind of stuff. Because of the time and because my skills were almost at the perimeter of my understanding of this, let me try the easy button and see what happens if we do an AZD up. Oh, okay. So it's saying we can't do that until we've logged in. AZD auth login. Again, that's a very similar syntax to the GitHub CLI. If you've used the GH command line interface, it's GH auth login to sign in there. But anyway, I'm not seeing any browser-based auth flow here. I'm not sure exactly what the heck's going on right now. This is live without a net, as it were. Okay, there we go. It happened on my other monitor. Let me sign in, retrieving subscriptions. Hopefully it'll default to the correct one. We'll find out in a moment. But I'm sure there's an AZD context that'll allow us to shift to the correct subscription. I'm going to live dangerously here. Oh, here it is. So it looks like AZD up is enumerating those. So I can just select my Azure Pass subscription by hitting enter. And is it going to ask me locations or just default to whatever might be in my bicep file? I probably don't have a default in that bicep because that was just auto-gen. While we're waiting for that, actually, I don't want to forget. Let me bring up Edge. Awesome AZD templates. This is a pretty cool site that I'd like you to keep your eye on. Azure.github.io awesome AZD. And this is analogous to the Azure Quick Start templates gallery where you can get bicep and JSON deployment templates. This is analogous, but these are pre-created GitHub projects where they've followed those rules to create that full scaffold and has all the best practices already baked in. And so looks like there's some templates that are particularly wanted in the community, and you could do a big solid to the community by creating and submitting a template to the gallery. But this would be useful again for you and your developer colleagues to see if somebody has already built an AZD template for your use case. And that way you can just do a git clone, change your directory in, and then you can do an init locally. That's what I would do. Let's come back here, and it's asking us what our region is. I'll use East US 2, that's fine. And that's really it. It's going to just go on from there. So I could see this as where, this is GitOps, isn't it? GIT-OPS, where you've got a single Git repository that has your application source code, your pipeline code, and your infrastructure code. That in itself goes such a long way to developing a DevOps culture, because by definition, your DevOps engineers, your IT ops infrastructure people, and your developers are all working in the same context, the same repositories, a lot of the same tools and processes, you see. And I can see you invoking just AZD up, and then maybe, I don't know if it accepts parameters where you could answer subscription and that kind of stuff. I'm sure you can, where just those AZD space UP, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 characters would be enough for you to deploy or update this entire environment. That's pretty cool, it seems to me. What questions you have for me? It looks like it's a little after 7 o'clock. What's up? I don't see anything new in chat. Anybody want to come off mute and give an opinion or a question? What's on your mind?
I do have a question. I see that you were using the IntelliSense, if I'm saying it correctly. In regular PowerShell, what is, because I know they deprecated that in the regular PowerShell. So is there like a replacement if you want to use that in regular PowerShell?
Well, in VS Code, as long as you have the PowerShell extension installed, that should be all you need in order to get IntelliSense both in your editor as well as in your terminal. Am I understanding you correctly? Does that make sense? What are you saying is deprecated?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm talking about like regular PowerShell. Like you had the IS. Maybe I'm not using the terminology correctly, but like it was the editor, well, the ISC editor or something. So,
right.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but the ISC editor has been deprecated. I mean, you can still use it, but Microsoft no longer supports it. But the thing I liked about that is it had the little IntelliSense thing, so you can always like kind of get an idea of what your code or what your PowerShell script looks like, before you actually run it.
Yeah, you're right. Yes. Okay. I think I understand what you're saying now. Right. The Windows PowerShell ISC is no longer being supported by Microsoft. This is because it doesn't work with PowerShell 7. So technically, could you install the Azure PowerShell modules under PowerShell 5.1 and continue to use the ISC? Absolutely, yes. But there's not going to be any further development. Yes, it's still, Alexander is providing color in the chat. Still supported, it works with Windows PowerShell, but there is a caveat to that. There's a MS Learn Docs article where they say essentially that ISC is going to be around built into Windows Client and Windows Server for the foreseeable future, but it's basically just getting bug fixes. It's not getting any enhancements, and it's not going to be rewritten to work with PowerShell 7. So really, in terms of being forward thinking and standardizing on PowerShell 7, ISC only works with Windows PowerShell 5.1. So that to me is its biggest weakness. Now it does have really fast IntelliSense. There's no question about it. But again, in VS Code, we should also, as long as you install the PowerShell extension, you're also going to get that IntelliSense. And this is actually GitHub Copilot trying to fill in the rest of this command. And this is a good example, actually, of where I'm getting some conflict between the built-in IntelliSense that comes from the PowerShell extension versus GitHub Copilot. What else you got? Anybody? No? Well, let me finish the slide deck here because the last part of the presentation is which CLI to use when. Let me quickly give you some guidance. Take it or leave it, just one person's opinion. Of course, I don't speak for Microsoft, Pluralsight, or anybody else. I speak only for myself. As I mentioned, at Microsoft, some dev teams have a preference towards PS or CLI, and you'll see that reflected. For example, the Azure configuration management tools like Azure Auto Manage, most of those devs are, long-time Windows experts. So they have, I don't want to use the term bias, but a clear emphasis more on PowerShell. By contrast, a lot of the engineers who work on the Azure container services like container registry, container instances, and Kubernetes service, they're just the opposite, where they're Linux and Mac, and they have a very strong preference for Azure CLI. So there's not full feature parity between PowerShell and CLI. So that's why I recommend that you develop them both in your skill set. Generally speaking, you can go with your team's CLI preference, again, based on what they're most comfortable with. All three of these CLIs are usable in an automation CI/CD context, as we've previously mentioned. So I would submit, consider Azure PowerShell when you don't have a choice. That is, the Azure service seems to ignore Azure CLI. Azure Functions is another example where you have support for PowerShell, but absolutely no support for CLI. 2, you need to call legacy modules. In other words, you're working with Azure, but you also need to call older modules that may be out of Azure. Maybe you're multi-cloud and you want a consistent CLI interface. And third, you need the power that an object orientation gives you rather than just working with strings that we have in the Azure CLI. So those are solid recommendations for emphasizing Azure PowerShell. Azure CLI would be, again, if the Azure service tends to ignore Azure PowerShell, you may not have a choice. Azure Container Registry, for example, has a whole collection of CLI commands. It's called Azure ACR tasks that allow you to, it's basically abstraction on a lot of the Docker CLI commands where you can build images and push and pull, and you can do all that using Azure CLI. 2, your teammates skew towards non-Windows operating systems. They'll probably be more naturally comfortable with CLI. Or sometimes you might find in an interactive command prompt session, you're just faster with CLI. That is true for me. PowerShell sometimes is criticized for being a bit verbose. Lastly, use the Developer CLI when you want standardization. Your developers should standardize on app templates and make sure that they're coming right out of the gate with as many checks crossed as possible. 2, you're practicing GitOps and you want to standardize again on bundling infrastructure and pipeline code with application code. And 3, you're looking to foster a DevOps culture with your devs and infrastructure people. So let me see, anything else in the summary? Use the tool sets that make the most sense. Yeah, it's not an either or proposition for sure. And if you are studying for Microsoft certifications, count on skilling up on both Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell. Again, the session materials, rebrand.ly/CLI, and that will be a direct link to a PDF version of this slide deck. And if you want to engage with me at any time, you can find me for now. I'll be on Blue Sky once I get my account, but for now I'm on Twitter at TechTrainerTim. My website is techtrainertim.com. And that's all I got. Back to you, Bill.
Okay, great job, Tim, as usual. This
Thank
the
you.
video will be posted in a couple of days. And everyone else have a good evening, and we'll see you next month.
All right, thank you.
Take care.